Our next conversation is with National Economic Council Director Gene Sperling. As I mentioned at the top, Gene is at the center of the discussion on budgets and fiscal policy. No one has a more detailed knowledge of the administration's plan than Gene Sperling. Please welcome Gene Sperling. Hi, Gene. Good to see you.
Thanks, Maria.
You heard the conversation with Congressman Ryan.
Yes.
How does the president's plan differ?
The president's plan differs in that it has at its fundamental tenets a sense of balance, that every category is on the table, and that you have to have shared sacrifice when you're doing fiscal discipline. Now, the president did put forward a very serious framework. It did $4 trillion in deficit reduction over 12 years. It was praised by Bowles and Simpson. It was praised by this organization, the Peterson organization, by virtually every validator. It is absolutely the case that Chairman Ryan's plan does get to $4 trillion quicker over 10 years as opposed to 12. But we think that that is appropriate because we want, number one, we don't want to phase things in at 9% unemployment in a way that in any way impedes our recovery. Two, we think it's very important that as you are trying to control entitlement costs, trying to control the deficit, that you don't stop investing in the future in terms of education, research, science, the things that are critical for our competitiveness. And third, we do believe it is more important to protect the fundamental social compact that we see in programs like Medicaid and Medicare. And we think that the president put out a very serious plan. It had Medicare and Medicaid savings of $470 billion over 12 years. It had over $1 trillion of discretionary spending over 12 years. It did have $1 trillion of revenues. So it had really a plan that did $4 trillion, $3 in spending cuts, including interest savings, for every dollar of revenue increases. But I want to hit the shared sacrifice point. I've been involved in several deficit reduction efforts, and here's the news. Nobody likes deficit reduction. The way deficit reduction happens in our country is when everybody dislikes it in a kind of equally, in a way that they think is fair. So it's very important, if you're going to even go into programs like Medicaid and ask for savings, if you're going to squeeze on discretionary spending in ways that deal with research and science, if you're going to do these things and ask for sacrifice, people need to know we're all in this together. So when we talk about things like why it's important not to permanently extend the high-income tax cuts, it's not just the numbers. It's not just the extra $1 trillion, though that's important.
Is it $1 trillion?
It is $1 trillion over 10 years to both extend the increase in the estate tax exemption and the upper income tax cuts that are at dispute. $1 trillion. Now, the reason that's important beyond that trillion is look what's happening on the Medicaid side. You're going to cut $770 billion. $770 billion. You can't say to anybody who would be affected by that we have to do that we have no choice. We've had the greatest financial recession since the 30s. We've inherited a huge deficit and debt, and we have to deal with this. Because the fact is that all of those savings would be unnecessary if you were not funding the high-income tax cuts. So it's important for having the kind of moral power to ask everybody to sacrifice, that you include revenues in the package, and particularly revenues on the most fortunate. It's not about class warfare. It's about shared sacrifice, and it's about having the moral authority to ask everybody in the country to be part of an effort that is going to squeeze us a little in the short term and medium term, but for the benefit of restoring confidence in our long-term economic future.
I want to ask you about the IPAB mechanism, but we're on taxes.
Sure.
Let's stay on taxes for a minute. You just heard Chairman Ryan talk about what he sees are negative implications of raising taxes on anyone, and he said it was about economic growth. So talk to us about that. And you said it's shared responsibility, but we do have so many tax expenditures, and many people agree on both sides of the aisle that real tax reform is required rather than necessarily taking the highest earners up and taxing the way you're talking about.
All right, well, three points. Number one, I don't think anybody engaged in a serious discussion about our fiscal and economic future should make claims that what happens to the marginal tax rate at the top is going to be the sole explanation of whether we grow or not. I don't think that's a good idea, but I particularly think Chairman Ryan and others shouldn't try to make it from their perspective, because if you are going to look at that in that kind of more simplistic causal way, the evidence doesn't look too good over the last 20 years. Everything he said, I heard 9 million times in 1993, and then the next 8 years were 8 of the strongest years our country's had in the 20th century. Then we cut taxes significantly and had an administration that did not have one net private sector job growth. Now, I am not claiming that that is that simple. That's not my claim. I'm just saying I don't think it's wise for people on that side to make it, because it's a simplistic argument and history doesn't help them. And the truth is that you're doing this as part of an overall fiscal discipline package. And if you do that, you will create confidence in your country. You will create confidence for people to make long-term investments because they believe we have the political will to compromise and do things that are significant to get our fiscal house in order and live within our means. And so I think that's very important. And, you know, I really want to point out how isolated the House Republicans are in their line that it's just a spending problem, not a revenue problem. I mean, that is good message discipline. It is not good fiscal discipline. If you look at any serious effort, 1982, after Ronald Reagan, tax cut was seen as hurting the deficit too much. Ronald Reagan was part of a tax-raising effort in 82. In 83, on Social Security. On 86, they raised taxes and cut others as part of tax reform. In 1990, President Bush and Speaker Foley. In 1997, the Republicans agreed to keep in and maintain the tax increases in 90 and 97. People talk about Cameron in the UK. Cameron has about the exact same proportion of revenue increases in his budget as we do in ours. So serious people doing serious discussions do not take an absolutist position that you cannot have a penny of revenue. It is never none of the bipartisan plans, the Peterson-Pugh plan, none of them take that position. 10 former CEA chairs, including people like Marty Feldstein and Greg Mankiw, all came out and said you need a mix of revenues. And so I think this is really holding back our chance to do something major, because you can't get the sense of shared sacrifice if revenues are completely off the table, number one. Number two, it's hard to ask other people to do things perhaps on entitlements that they don't want to do or haven't wanted to do if there's no willing to compromise on the revenue side. And third, you know, there is a disconnect between what Chairman Ryan says about which I'm sure are his sincere intentions and what the impact his plans on Medicaid and food stamps would have for millions of not so fortunate Americans. And I think the reason that happens is he's put himself in a box. By having not be willing to do any revenue, even as part of tax reform, it forces them to do very severe cuts that I think if people explored, they would not be proud of. And that really goes to your last issue, which is we are very open to having a tax reform plan where you cut tax expenditures and use some of those savings to lower rate and some of those to lower the deficit. That is what the Bowles-Simpson plan's been for. That's what most of the bipartisan plans. If we had that commitment, then we would have a balanced commitment that revenue was going to be part of the equation, and I think that would go a long way. But right now, we still have this absolutist position, even though every analysis of why we have a deficit problem right now certainly includes the long expected aging of the population, but almost any analysis shows we have $500 billion a year of higher deficits because of the tax cuts in the Bush era that were never paid for. We support some of those, but we just need to be honest. There has been a revenue problem, and if we had paid for the tax cuts in 2000, we might not be having this conference right now.
Isn't there evidence? In fact, didn't Christina Romer do work on the fact that when you allow people to keep more of their income, they will spend it in the economy?
Well, there's no question that when you are trying to, put more spending into the economy in the short term, when you're trying to essentially have a Keynesian impact, that you want to give, you want to put money out where it'll be spent the quickest, have the highest multiplier impact. But actually, that argues, when you are giving that type of tax relief to help the economy in the short run, to give money to those who have, as they say, the highest propensity to spend. In other words, when you're making $38,000 a year and you get an extra $500, you're probably going to spend close to $500 of that. It's going to get out in the economy and help. When you give somebody making $3.8 million an extra $500, they may not remember where they left the check. So that actually, again, argues more that when you're trying to do tax relief, you want to center it more on people who are living paycheck by paycheck. And that's what we've done by having the payroll tax cut for this year, which has been very important for economic growth, particularly with higher gas prices. And that's the type of tax relief we've pushed for people in the middle class who are more likely to need the money paycheck to paycheck and put it out in the economy and help us get higher growth.
Let's talk about spending cuts and your thoughts on Chairman Ryan's ideas on Medicare and Medicaid. The Affordable Care Act maps Medicare spending through the Independent Payment Advisory Board, IPAB, mechanism. Why do you think that the small group of people serving on IPAB could possibly make wise decisions about cost reimbursements in light of the enormous size and complexity of the healthcare market in the United States? Why is command and control the right approach for this problem?
So you might not shock you that I wouldn't have defined the question the exact same way that you did. So a couple things. Number one, it's good, we're talking about this IPAB issue, the independent board, because in the president's plan, which was not just not a speech or press release, but a plan, we put out levels of detail that included saying that in 2018 and beyond, we actually would tighten our focus on Medicare growth by saying that where it was above GDP plus 0.05 per person in Medicare, that the IPAB would look for additional savings. So first of all, we're having this discussion now about our plan because we have put out significant details. Look, here's the justification for it. A lot of people for years, Democrats and Republicans, said Medicare, unlike Social Security, is a little harder just to figure out what, combination of different adjustments or revenue adjustments you need, because healthcare is very dynamic. But unfortunately, we don't act as much because it has often been caught up in the political system. So the idea was to try to create a more independent, non-political way of dealing with that. And there's been a lot of accusations of demagoguery, but if someone doesn't like that idea, let's have another suggestion. But the basic idea of bringing more expertise into our system, more independent expertise to help adjust Medicare as we learn more about quality and delivery system efficiencies in a way that doesn't have to go through two houses of Congress all the time, doesn't have to be subject to all the politics, was, I think, a very well-intentioned and, I think, smart idea. And if it's not the best idea, then let's hear something. I think one of the most unfortunate things going on right now has been the complete politicization of the Affordable Care Act. President Obama does not sit around and say, boy, we're going to defend every little thing that we've done to the T. He would welcome constructive criticism or comments about how we could do things better. But we have a healthcare spending problem in our country, and we put together a very thoughtful effort that tried to take all of the type of reforms, whether affordable, the comprehensive care, the different payment systems, the IPAB, and these things right now have just become political fodder. So part of the reason we're not having, so I agree with Chairman Ryan on one thing. We should be able to have more serious discussion about the specifics of our plan, and I think it would make it easier for us to figure out what we agree and disagree on and how we can make progress.